professional dancer, and I specialize in dances from the 1920s through to around about 1946, the end of the Second World War. And so I am going to try and introduce you in the small amount of time to the fascinating history of my dances, and I'm gonna speed through some of the timeline so that we can hopefully get time to really have a look at some videos of some dancing, so you can see this wonderful, joyful dance that I love so much, where it came from and how it managed to spread all around the world and end up with a little Aussie girl learning this dance that originated in the USA 75 years ago. So let's get started. I have for you a jazz man's map of the world. So this is a map of the United States, America, and right down the bottom you'll see we have New Orleans, and New Orleans is where it all began. So in the previous centuries, in the 19th century and earlier, New Orleans was a major port for the slave trade. So the Americans were bringing slaves from West Africa to New Orleans, and it was also a previous French colony before it was bought by the United States of America. So it was the greatest boiling pot that has ever been. It was a port town, so it was where the comings and goings for centuries were. And in this marvelous boiling pot of African and European influences, something marvelous was born, and that was jazz music. So New Orleans was a city of culture. They had 4 symphony orchestras, they had theaters, and they also, of course, with high culture there is always low culture, and in New Orleans that happened in a place called Storyville. So Storyville was formed in 1897, and it was a way for the government to try to restrict the rampant prostitution into a 38-block area just near the French Quarter in New Orleans. And since that's where the prostitution industry went, that's where the party went. And so Storyville became where all of the best entertainment and nightlife was. And in that atmosphere, where people of all backgrounds, African American, European American, and everything in between met, and jazz music was born in that heady atmosphere. And of course, where there is dancing, where there is music, there is dancing. So as jazz music started to spread around the USA, it made it to Charleston, South Carolina, and one particular dance was born there. So I'm guessing you guys might have heard of the Charleston. So the Charleston is the great-grandfather of all of my dances. This is where it all began, and it was not the first jazz dance, but it was certainly the most popular. So we usually put the date 1923 on the beginning of the Charleston, not because that's when it really started. They were dancing it, and it evolved in the nightclubs of Charleston, South Carolina from the early 1920s onwards. But in 1923, James P. Johnson wrote a song called The Charleston. Charleston, Charleston, made in Carolina. You've probably heard that melody before, right? Yeah, and he wrote it for a Broadway musical called Running Wild. And so through that Broadway musical, it was introduced to New York, and in touring beyond that all around the United States. So this song, The Charleston, and the dance that went with it was introduced to the rest of the country beyond the city of Charleston, where it was named. So I don't know if you guys ever seen the Charleston. I'm sorry, back row, I know you can't see me so well, but the Charleston looks a little bit like this. It is all about the feet. That's why I'm apologizing to the back row. Yeah, so if this looks a little bit familiar, there's a whole bunch of dances in the last 5 years, like shuffling. You guys heard of that one? Every day I'm shuffling. It's just Charleston. It's just Charleston. So it's all about some crazy foot action, and it's all done to hot jazz that came out of New Orleans. So got a few pictures there, some Charleston dancing. So what happened between hot jazz being born in New Orleans and this moment in Charleston where a dance was born that became a national craze, is that they shut down Storyville. So that district, nightlife districts of New Orleans, where everything was happening, where this amazing music called jazz was born, they decided, the local government decided they needed to shut it down. It happened around 1917. It's when US troops were being sent to Europe for the First World War, and New Orleans was one of the major ports of embarkation for the troops, and the US Navy had a strong presence in the port there, and they decided that they didn't want these immoral influences the troops to be exposed to them before heading off to war. And so the US Navy put pressure on the New Orleans local government, and they decided to shut down Storyville, this great district of nightlife, jazz music, dancing, and more immoral things after that. So it was shut down, and what was there to do but the musicians, the dancers had to leave. So maybe you've heard of Louis Armstrong. That's probably one of the names that everyone would recognize. So Louis Armstrong was a musician in New Orleans in that time, the greatest trumpeter of all time. And he and many, many others went on the road and headed to other cities north, like Chicago, like St. Louis, like New York City. So maybe if I just pop back to my Jazzman's map of the world, you can see here from New Orleans, once Storyville closed, the musicians and the culture spread seeking work, essentially. So Kansas City, Chicago, St. Louis in the middle, and New York City on the East Coast being the major jazz towns after New Orleans. So, shall we look at a little Charleston? See some authentic footage from the archives. The Charleston is a really fun dance, and that was the point of it. The reason it caught the cultural imagination of the USA is because this was a really interesting moment in history. After the First World War, before the Depression had hit the USA, before Second World War came along, the atmosphere was exuberant. Everyone was in celebration mode. This is before the stock market crash as well. No one knew the terrible things that were coming. All they wanted to do was celebrate the end of the war, and also to be different to their parents' generation. So the Charleston and jazz music was taken on board by young Americans, and it was the beginning of this idea of youth culture that hadn't really existed before the 1920s or post-World War I came along in the USA. You mostly followed the trends, be that for your entertainment, for your fashion, for your career, of your parents. And now, after the atrocities of World War I, everyone wanted to define themselves as something very different to their parents' generation, that generation that sent the world into war. And so it was a breath of fresh air. It was a little bit rebellious. It was, well, maybe a lot rebellious. And so it, for what all of these reasons combined, just sparked the imagination of the whole nation, and Charleston became, and still is, the biggest dance fad that's ever been seen in the world. It spread across North America and then onwards to the rest of the world. It was danced in Europe, it was danced in the nightclubs of London in the 1920s, all the way in Australia, where I'm from, the biggest dance fad ever. And there were other dance fads in the 1920s. There were a lot of animal dances like the grizzly bear, the turkey trot, lots of fad dances. The black bottom was another big one. And so whether it was the popularity of the music that spread the dances, or the popularity of the dances that spread the music, who's to say, but with them being perfectly timed for the feeling of the nation. And also, of course, with new technologies, so radio, for one thing, vinyl records. There was just a new capacity to spread music around the country, and that carried the dance with it. So throughout the 1920s, dance is the new pastime for young people, and the music is changing as well. It's evolving. With popularity, there's money. With money, they can grow the size of the bands. The bands are getting bigger, and the music is getting more complex. So in New Orleans, they were playing often in 6 or 7 piece combos, and as the 1920 goes along, those start to turn into big bands, 10 pieces, 12 pieces, 18 pieces, 22 piece jazz orchestras. And with that many people, you need to get more organized with the music. So they start to write arrangements, and the rhythms start to change. Everything gets more complex, and what was hot jazz, or Dixieland jazz is another name for it, in New Orleans, by the time we get to New York in the late 1920s, it is becoming what we think of now as swing. So swing just means a slightly different rhythm to the hot jazz that was played in New Orleans. You might hear in New Orleans in 1918, you might hear a boom chuck, boom chuck, boom chuck, boom chuck. By the time we get to 1928 New York, it's smoothed out and it's starting to sound like and so the dance that was up here with the Charleston, that was super bouncy and energetic, starts to smooth out with the music as well. So there's this constant evolution through the 1920s. So we're in New York, we're in the African American district of Harlem. Has anyone ever been to Harlem before? It's still there, just north of Central Park in New York City and Manhattan. Louis Armstrong has made it to New York by this time, and he is playing with Fletcher Henderson's orchestra. Another big orchestra at the time is Duke Ellington, another name you might know. Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington's orchestra ruled New York, and they played in Harlem in this district. So we make it to 1926, and this is a really important moment. The Savoy Ballroom is opened on 12th of March, 1926. And it occupied an entire city block from 140th to 141st Streets in Harlem, New York, the biggest ballroom that the USA had ever seen. And unlike other ballrooms in Harlem, it's not segregated. It's an integrated ballroom. So it's primarily for the African American community in Harlem, but it is open to all. So white dancers and black dancers alike go and dance in the Savoy Ballroom. And we often call it, and it called itself, the home of happy feet. It became the heart of dancing in the USA, and all the great dance trends came out of the Savoy Ballroom from that day onwards. So that's just a lovely photo. I love this photograph because it's not retouched, it's not recolored. That's an original color photograph of the Savoy Ballroom. You can see it there. Sadly, it is not there anymore. It's been pulled down. So Charleston was being danced in the Savoy Ballroom. These are photographs from inside the ballroom. In 1926 and onwards when it came. 1926, 1927 was kind of the peak of Charleston, and since it was being danced with such wild abandon in the Savoy Ballroom, it of course also started to evolve. So it was danced with a bit more exuberance in the Savoy Ballroom, and they started to break away from each other. So you might have seen how they were dancing in those clips from the 1920s. They were holding themselves in a quite European close embrace and dancing it in this kind of shape, quite upright. This was the 1920s Charleston, around 1925-26. The dancers in the Savoy Ballroom started to get a bit more excited, and they would stretch away from each other into what we call an open embrace or open position, holding just one hand with lots of space, the most exuberant type of dance style you could have. So this dance was being danced. It didn't look like Charleston anymore, but it didn't really have a name at this stage until does anyone recognize this handsome devil? So Charles Lindbergh was also called Lucky Lindy, and he was one of the biggest celebrities of the 1920s and 30s. So in 1927, he flew across the Atlantic, and the titles in the newspapers said, "Lindy hops the Atlantic." So the story goes that a journalist was in the Savoy Ballroom and grabbed one of the dancers whose name happened to be George Snowden, who we call Shorty George. So he was a little guy, one of the greatest dancers in the Savoy Ballroom, and a journalist came up and said, "What is this dance you're doing?" And a legend has it, he says, it's called, and he spied a newspaper. It's called the Lindy Hop. Yeah, it's called the Lindy Hop. We're doing the Lindy Hop. So that is the legend for that unusual name that we have for our dance. It is named after Charles Lindbergh and his famous solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927. So the dance now has a name. So I have for you a nightclub map of Harlem. This is one of the greatest documents ever. It's got so many beautiful details on it. Here we have Lenox Avenue and the Savoy Ballroom doing the Lindy Hop over here. We also have the Cotton Club and a lot of other landmarks that you might know, because this was the home of jazz and jazz dancing, swing and swing dancing in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. So a nightclub map of Harlem. So white Americans flocked to Harlem. They would go uptown, as they say, go uptown to witness the Lindy Hop, this wild new dance in the Savoy Ballroom, where they were welcomed because it was an integrated ballroom. And also musical theater, vaudeville, nightclubs, all tried to capitalize on this dance by hiring the best dancers out of the Savoy Ballroom. So I mentioned the Cotton Club, where Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington's bands played. They also had a floor show. They hired the best dancers out of the Savoy Ballroom to dance there for the strictly white audience that was allowed to go to that nightclub. So another name that you might recognize at this stage is in the Savoy Ballroom in 1931, the house band Chick Webb's orchestra was forced to take on board a very young singer by the name of Ella Fitzgerald. He didn't want to take her on. He thought that she was too fat. But everybody forced him to, and the moment he heard her sing, he was completely won over. So that's a picture of Ella Fitzgerald. This is Chick Webb, the band leader and drummer. She had won a talent contest at the Apollo, a talent contest that still exists to this day in Harlem, the Apollo Theater. And so that landed her this job, singing at the Savoy Ballroom with Chick Webb's orchestra. And when he eventually died, she actually took on his band and it became the Ella Fitzgerald Orchestra. So just a little context there. This is really where the great musicians, the great singers, were their careers were born, in the Savoy Ballroom. So the greatest bands are playing in the Savoy Ballroom. The greatest dancers are dancing the Lindy Hop, this new dance of the age. And along comes one particular dancer whose name is Frankie Manning. What a smile. Gets me every time. Frankie Manning. And a enterprising bouncer at the Savoy Ballroom decided that he would take it upon himself to gather together the best dancers from the Savoy and form a troupe, which he called Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. His name was Hubert White. He also had a white streak through his hair. Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. And he decided that Frankie Manning was the best amongst them and that he would become the leader of the troupe. So Whitey's Lindy Hoppers was the greatest Lindy Hop team, company troupe that ever lived, and their leader was this gentleman, Frank Manning, or as we call him, Frankie Manning. There are some pictures of Frankie and the Whitey's Lindy Hoppers dancing the Lindy Hop. And most notably, they really came to fame by competing in a dance competition called the Harvest Moon Ball. Has anybody heard that before? The Harvest Moon Ball? So the Harvest Moon Ball, forget Strictly, the Harvest Moon Ball was the biggest dance competition that has ever been. It was held in Madison Square Gardens, and there would be 50 to 60,000 people in the audience watching. And this happened, it was an annual competition, and its highlight was the Lindy Hop. They also had other more traditional dances like waltz and other things. During the wars, they had servicemen divisions, and you can see a lot of this footage on the internet if you're interested too. The Harvest Moon Ball, the annual competition, and it was won year after year after year by the Savoy dancers. They were the best. So we're going to watch next a clip of Whitey's Lindy Hoppers dancing the Lindy Hop in the early 1940s. So this is the dance that evolved out of Charleston, but it's going to look very, very different. And this clip is often considered to be the greatest piece of footage of Lindy Hop ever captured. It is choreographed by Frankie Manning, and he is dancing in it, so I'll point him out. He's the last dancer to come out. But this is from a film called Hell's a Poppin', which is a terrible film. But it has this wonderful dance scene in it. So from Hell's a Poppin'.
Hey Pops, keep that beat a beat. I feel a rhythmic brainstorm coming on. 1, 2, keep that rhythm heat. Like that, I'll be gone. Oh man, don't stop now, we're jumping. Give everything to Lord now. This thing might turn into something. I ain't mistaken, here comes something now. put him in the next room.
So Hills of Pop in 1941, the Lindy Hop, danced by Whitey's Lindy Hoppers from the Savoy Ballroom, and the gentleman in the overalls was Frankie Manning, and Frankie was my teacher. So when I learned from him, he was in his 80s. And there's only one other dancer from this film clip alive today. Her name is Norma Miller. She was the third dancer to come out. She had a chef's hat on, and she's still alive today. She is 96 years old. She's still touring the world and teaching this dance. So it certainly is exciting to watch. This is definitely demonstrating the more acrobatic side of my dance. Don't worry, it's not always like that. But I guess one thing that might be of interest to you and your topic today is, of course, the Savoy Ballroom was an integrated ballroom where black and white Americans could dance together. But to feature an African-American troupe in a Hollywood film like this, they had to be dressed as maids and gardeners and chefs. So the Savoy Ballroom was integrated, but America was not. So this is still the 1940s, before the Civil Rights Movement. So, and this is how a lot of the time my dance is depicted in Hollywood films from the 1930s and 40s. They are often either dressed as servants, or they are dressed as sort of rural farm workers, you know, plaid shirts and denim overalls, and often the storyline has to depict them as being in some way stupid or lazy, or any of those stereotypes that were still proliferated by Hollywood and all media at this time. So, but progress, at least they were the featured dancers in Hollywood films like this, and there were many, many others. Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, this team of dancers, they danced in dozens of Hollywood films. They danced on Broadway in shows. They performed in the Cotton Club, which was one of the most prestigious places to perform, and they toured all around America, and even came to Europe, went to Australia, went to South America. They toured the whole world. They were some of the most famous dancers of the time. So because of the popularity of the dance, it of course started to spread. The music was being played in all ballrooms all over America, and despite opposition from various camps in the USA, white American youth desperately wanted to do this dance. So there was some racially charged opposition from many camps, from religious leaders, from prohibitionists in the 1920s, even medical professionals, doctors, and of course from traditional dance institutions who wanted European dances to be the dance of choice for America's youth. So religious leaders, especially in the 1930s, really tried to denounce Lindy Hop. They like to mark it as being somehow pagan and profane, and also scientific racism came into play. So they would trace the liveliness of Lindy Hop back to the African jungle, saying that it was primitive, that it was barbaric in some way. So I think I have my favorite quote, this one. Okay, I love this. The Catholic Archbishop in 1938, who said, "We permit, if not freely endorsed by our criminal indifference, jam sessions, jitterbugs, and cannibalistic rhythmic social scheme of things, wooing our youth along the primrose path to hell." Wow. That is the Catholic Archbishop in 1938 on this dance, on a dance. Can you imagine? So the white opposition to Lindy Hop had two distinct effects. Firstly, it unified the African American communities in pride for their culture. So that being the music and the dance, and pride that was distinctly African American. So being African American, there hadn't been a particularly strong culture up until this point, now that they were producing their own culture. So on the flip side, it of course, as soon as there was any kind of opposition, the young white Americans decided to appropriate this dance for some of the same reasons we talked about Charleston in the 1920s. So they appropriated the dance not particularly out of amity with African Americans, but as a means of explicit resistance to societal norms, to the values of their parents and the previous generation. It was classic rebellion. Classic rebellion. So both young white American youth and the African American communities were trying to define themselves as distinct from the white American establishment. And the dance and the music is how they did it. So as it spread across the country, most white Americans called it the jitterbug instead of Lindy Hop. And the idea being that came from their parents, who thought it was like some sort of infectious disease, that they had been bitten by the bug. The idea that once you got the jitterbug, you couldn't get rid of it. And of course, because you do look a little bit like you're jittering when you dance this dance. So it became known as the jitterbug. So it's exactly the same dance. It's just that typically the African American community would call it the Lindy or the Lindy Hop, and the white American community would call it the jitterbug. So despite our Catholic Archbishop and everyone else's critique of the dance, it had become mainstream. So by 1942, even the New York Society of Teachers of Dancing had to officially introduce the jitterbug into their course repertoire. And the Arthur Murray School of Dancing, have you guys heard of the Arthur Murray School of Dancing? They were very big in the 40s, a little less big now. They introduced both Lindy and jitterbug into their curriculum, so that is really the marker that it had made it into the institutions. It was entirely mainstream. So we have some white jitterbug dancers. You can see in the photo on the left that we've got both African American and white Americans dancing in the same ballroom. Yeah, a few more photos for you. The one on the right, if you're in this case, your school hall would not allow you to ruin the floors by dancing in your shoes. You would take off your shoes and have what you call a sock hop. So this was a sock hop at a high school, and some more jitterbug dancers. So by 1943, Lindy Hop was featured on the cover of Life magazine. It has beautiful, 12-page spread in there featuring pictures of white dancers who did make it onto the cover, but also inside a black couple from the Savoy Ballroom are dancing inside. And the photographic essay inside calls Lindy Hop a true national folk dance. So by 1943, it has been accepted as an American art form and is danced by black and white Americans. So let's have a look at some people dancing the jitterbug. This is from a movie in 1944 called, it's a short, and it's called Groovy Movie. This is just an excerpt. The whole thing is about 10 minutes, and I'll just show a few minutes of it. But we do also have two of these dancers are still alive today. This lady here, her name is Irene Thomas, and she lives in Los Angeles. And this lady on the end here, her name is Jean Veloz, and she's one of my teachers, and she's still alive today.
And now the group precision jitterbug, in which the steps are executed on command, as was the custom in the old country square dance. Ready? Send out. And through. Shoulder twist. Release. Tread switch. Spread out. Now, fixed up drop. Solid. Now let's hit that jive.
1944. A little bit odd, but very entertaining. Good. So this brings us to the early 1940s, before the USA has joined the Second World War. This is the glory period for swing music and swing dancing, including Lindy Hop and the Jitterbug. So sadly, that brings us to the decline that came after the spread. So just to summarize, swing music had been spread across the USA and around the world with the spread of sheet music, with records, vinyl records, and radio, the last two being, in really actually sheet music as well, all being because of the new technology, and with that also cinema, the invention of the 1920s, as you guys know. So these new technologies enabling the spread of a type of music and a type of dance in ways that had not been possible even 20 years before that. Also the bands toured around the USA and further afield. So Lindy Hop was witnessed in cinemas, in ballrooms, in nightclubs all around the country. And then as World War II began, American GIs and sailors also spread the culture around the globe. So World War II is, of course, the kicker that brings us to the end of this glory period for my dance. So World War II musicians and dancers were drafted into the military, for one thing, so the dancers were just taken away from the ballrooms. And there was actually a tax on dance halls in wartime once the USA joined the Second World War. So a lot of ballrooms were repurposed, and that was true here as well. And they rationed fuel in World War II, so the bands couldn't tour anymore. So all of the great swing bands that previously were constantly touring around the USA, they couldn't tour, they couldn't leave their cities as easily. And nightlife in general declined, of course, during the war. So the bands that used to be 22-piece orchestras had to split up. They split into 6 or 7-piece combos instead. So the bands got smaller. The music therefore couldn't be as complex. And so it started to simplify, and from big band swing, this beautiful complex arrangements of 22 instruments, split into smaller combinations. Suddenly it's simplified, and we get the birth of more simple musics like rock and roll, like early R&B, or of more intellectual musics like bebop. So these are all musics that evolved out of jazz and big band swinging jazz in the 1940s. So bebop was too difficult, for the most part, undanceable, too difficult to dance to, and also just a bit too cerebral to dance to. And so dancing to bebop was not really a done thing. And Lindy Hop had to simplify to be danced to rock and roll music and to R&B music. So the dance simplified, and it turned into what you might know as rock and roll dancing, jive, Ciroc. Maybe you've heard of some of these dances. They all evolved out of Lindy Hop, but they're simplified versions because the music got much, much simpler. So by the 1960s, partner dancing went entirely out of fashion. So solo dances like the twist became the trend, and partner dancing really died out as a mass popular activity from the 1960s onwards. So Frankie Manning quit dancing in the mid-1950s. He went and got a job in the post office. He worked for the US Postal Office, and Lindy Hop and Jitterbug was essentially dead for 40 years. So they completely died out, they disappeared. As sad as that thought is. So luckily there was a revival in the 1980s. I don't know if this kind of image is familiar to anyone, or maybe you're not old enough to remember, but there was a revival in the early 1980s. So the major places where it happened was in Los Angeles and New York in the USA, here in London, and actually, oddly enough, in Stockholm in Sweden. So in those 4 cities in the 1980s, there was a revival of swing culture. And it came back for a lot of different reasons. So one was a sense of nostalgia about the swing era that belonged to our grandparents. By the 1980s, our grandparents were starting to age, and so nostalgia about how they lived their lives came back into fashion. With that, therefore, 1940s style fashion came back into fashion. So maybe some of you can bring to mind that 1980s does 1940s look, the big broad shoulder pads, triangular shapes, Blade Runner. You can think of this fashion trend. So the 1940s was big in the 1980s. It was also a movement away from this simplified music. So music had been musically very simple since the 1940s onwards. So 1980s and 1970s contemporary pop music had been this 3-chord simplified kind of music, a lot of electronic as well in the 1980s. And so there was a kind of movement back to some musical maturity, this interest in more complex music. Then we have, out of this trend, the birth of neo-swing. Have you guys heard of neo-swing? So neo-swing was a musical style of its own. It is inspired by swinging jazz music, but it had a distinctly modern sound to it. And it came out of Los Angeles, out of the ska and punk scenes there. They started picking up, adding horn sections to their bands, taking influences from swing, and then even just playing the same swing songs with a slightly different style. So neo-swing was a musical trend in the 1980s. And I think there was, if you know any of your history of the 1980s, especially in the USA, there was some sort of affinity of the 1980s generation with young people that had lived in the Depression era, the 1930s, and then during World War II, sort of the political atmosphere of the time. And then, of course, there was a kind of urgency felt because the generation that had danced these dances and done all the things that was the culture of the 1930s and 40s were aging. And so people started to realize that if they didn't take advantage of the opportunity to learn from their grandparents' generation, that all those art forms, those dances, those musics, and everything else that was done might be lost. So this kind of sense of urgency forced people to have an interest in these art styles. So that's why it came back at that particular time, a big combination of factors. So we have our neo-swing style of music. Most people say it was the decade spanning from 1989 to 1999. And maybe you've heard of some of these bands: Royal Crown Revue, Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, Cherry Poppin' Daddies, the Brian Setzer Orchestra, Indigo Swing. These were the big names of the neo-swing movement. And you can see they took on this 1940s style of dressing, particularly the Pachuco style out of New York, which is a Mexican-American style of dressing. Zoot suits, zoot pants. So neo-swing created a place where people could try to dance to a music similar to the big band swing of the 1940s. Anybody seen the movie Swing Kids? So this is 1993. It's Christian Bale playing a Nazi swing dancer in the Second World War with a splendid swing dance scene. So this was definitely part of what encouraged people to learn. I have a lot of professional dance friends who saw this movie, and that's why they started to learn the dance. So it was on the big screen. It was in music trends, and then the return of Frankie Manning. So as these trends started to pick up, people had an interest in the dance. They found some of the old footage, and they went to find Frankie Manning. They went to New York City, where he was still working in the post office. Some dancers, both American and some Swedish dancers, go figure, went to New York to find him and bring him out of retirement to teach this dance to the new generation. So Frankie returned, and he became known as the ambassador of swing. So as soon as he was brought out of retirement, he was in demand to teach all around the world. This poor man in his 70s, we flew him to every continent and forced him to teach us this dance. So he had a second dance career as the ambassador of swing, which he started when he was in his 70s. And as well as giving us the technical information about how to dance this dance, he really shaped the community because he had a very strong philosophy about jazz, dance, music, and life in general. He was an incredibly warm, upbeat person who believed in love and joy and connection, and he didn't believe in differences between human beings. And so he was a fundamentally positive and joyful force in the world, and that was the community that his influence built, being dragged across the globe. He literally went to any city that now has a swing dance community in it. He visited at some point in the last 30 years of his life. So we sadly lost him just before his 95th birthday. That is his headstone in New York where he is buried. So we would celebrate his birthday every year in New York City, and we would make him dance with as many girls as he was turning. So when he turned 94, he had to dance with 94 women and give each of them a kiss. And so this festival grew and grew to celebrate his birthday every year, and we were all gathered in New York City to celebrate his 95th birthday, and he sadly passed away just a few weeks before it. So what was going to be a celebration of his 95th birthday became a celebration of his life. And Frankie's vision for our dance is really, sorry. He was great. I wish you could have met him. I wish you could have heard his laugh. He was just a wonderful person. So his vision for the dance was, as you saw from earlier in the talk, that originally swing dancing was fraught with a lot of tensions about a lot of things, about race, obviously with the segregation between black and white Americans, but also over age between the older generation and American youth, and also about class and gender. There were a lot of tensions about this dance and this music. So now the swing dance community internationally is very different. It is very diverse and truly integrated. All genders, ages, races, ethnicities, religions, classes, and sexual orientations dance happily together without prejudice or segregation. And it really is a community that celebrates jazz and life with joy, and community is really important. So this one man and his philosophy on life and dancing managed to build a community that we estimate has somewhere between 50 and 70,000 dancers around the world. That is incredibly positive and is keeping both the music and the dance alive. So today, we are an international community with shared values, so it's not just about the dance, it's very much about Frankie's vision for how human beings should treat each other. And there's a lot of variety, so if you watch two different dancers dancing the Lindy Hop today, they'll look very different. So you saw a couple of different styles just on film in the archival footage. You might find dancers that look like that today, but you might find dancers that look very different. There's a lot of diversity in the style. And there's a lot of smaller communities. We're really strongly connected by social media. So that's one really interesting side of our community. In any given city, there might only be tens, maybe hundreds of dancers. There's a few where there's thousands, London being one of them. The biggest swing dance community in the world is in Seoul, South Korea. Go figure. I fly over there to teach a few times a year, and it is an epic swing dance community. The dance in the revival just struck a chord with them culturally, and it caught fire. So we are all connected by social media. Everyone is very tech savvy in the swing dance scene, and that means swing tourism, meaning traveling to other cities and other countries, is a really big part of the culture of the dance. So you, of course, take your lessons and go social dancing, go to swing dance parties in your city, but all swing dancers really do travel overseas to other cities to meet swing dancers, and swing tourism is a strong part of the culture, and that's because of the way Frankie connected us all together. So I just have a few photos of you just to show you how beautiful my dance is. These are from the European Swing Dance Championships, which is an event that I run, and oh, it's just people being happy, and I just love these photographs. So this is, these are dancers from all around the world dancing together. We have more than 30 countries represented at this event, the European Swing Dance Championships. So actually I can say these dancers are from Israel. These dancers are from France. These dancers are from Norway. These dancers, we have Australia and the UK there. They're French dancers. Oh, this one's really good. Okay, let me see. Norway, South Korea, France, Spain, Italy, the Ukraine. All in one picture. They're all dancing together. From Sweden, Italy, France. That's a British group. Lithuanians. Again, okay, UK, South Korea, Canada, UK, Japan, Italy, Lithuania, Italy, Sweden, France, Belgium, and the USA. There, so you can see swing dancers are from everywhere, and they all come to London for this event every year. So I thought I would just finish with letting you watch some modern Lindy Hop. This is a choreography from 2015 from a couple from France. Their names are William Mauvais and Maeva, now Mauvais. They are now married. There they are, William and Maeva from France. This is a choreography.
From France, William Mauvais and Maeva.
Maeva from France, and then I thought, let's finish with an improvisation, because this is really where the joy of Lindy Hop is. So like jazz music, Lindy Hop is an improvised art form. So you've seen a lot of choreographies today, because that's often what gets captured on film, of course, rehearsed routines. But the true heart and soul of both jazz music and all dances done to jazz music is improvisation. So I'm just going to finish with a video of two people dancing together, and this is not a routine. Everything that happens in the moment through the connection. So one person is a leader, one person is a follower. Traditionally, men are leaders, women are followers. Today, everyone does both, or we encourage that. I do both. In this clip, I've got a male leader and a female follower for you, but and the leader is responsible for initiating movement and choosing what the figures are going to be, and the follower has to instantaneously follow that movement purely through the hand-to-hand or body-to-body connection. So it's a little bit of dark magic. It's a skill that we learn in our classes and train into our bodies, and I think this is a really good example of how improvisation can look like it's choreographed, but this is completely... Dancers are from France.
Please give it up for your one-on-one, Max and Tatiana.
Strictly could do that. So this is my dance. This is Lindy Hop. If you are interested in learning more about it, a wonderful book I recommend is Frankie Manning's book. It's called The Ambassador of Swing. So you can get that on Amazon. It's very easy to find. When it came out, it was Amazon's top-selling book of the month, I think. So that goes to show what a following he has. On his birthday, which has been named World Lindy Hop Day, Google changes their avatar to images of Frankie dancing. So just goes to show that the influence is still really strong. So if you're interested in learning more about it, then please do, or of course you're more than welcome to look me up. Our goal as the people still living and dancing this wonderful art form is to keep it alive and to spread it further. you have seen the sort of pathway of its globalization and its evolution, but we're not even close to where we want it to be. So of course the ultimate goal is to have every single person on the planet dancing the Lindy Hop. So to end my little talk about globalization, help join my globalization of Lindy Hop effort and take a Lindy Hop class. Come join us in our beautiful, beautiful community. There are communities all over the UK, in pretty much every city there are swing dancers, so please do come in and try it out. Sometimes it is just a beautiful, joyful pastime and a great way to connect to other people. Thank you, everyone.